MassDEP's. Sorry about that. Good afternoon and welcome to MassDEP's second technical session this week on the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard. My name is Christine Kirby. I am MassDEP's Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau of Air and Waste. And joining me from the agency today are Will Space, Emily Lamb, and Josh Cook of VAW's Climate Strategies Group. Next slide, please. Many of you may have joined us on one of our virtual community meetings last Monday, and this week, including yesterday, we are holding 3 technical sessions on the Clean Heat Standard, and we will be covering 6 topics. We covered 2 yesterday, we will cover 2 today, and then 2 again tomorrow. For today, we will cover the calculation of credits by clean heat technology and hybrid heat system credits. We're very much interested in your comments and feedback. We will hold 1 more technical session tomorrow, as I said earlier, on the topics listed on this slide. Again, we are interested in and encourage your feedback on what we are covering today and encourage any comments going forward. And comments may be submitted to MassDEP's Climate Strategies email at any time, and that email is climate.strategies@mass.gov. And now I'd ask Emily to turn, I'll turn to Emily to cover meeting logistics. Emily?
Thanks, Christine. So as we mentioned, this meeting is being recorded and the recording will be posted on our webpage. We've muted all of the attendees to minimize background noise, and we would ask that you enter your full name and an affiliation if relevant in the participants panel. You can do that by clicking on the participants button, and then there's an option to rename yourself. Next slide. There'll be opportunities to participate in the meeting, both for clarifying questions throughout and then more detailed discussion within the meeting itself. So if you'd like to ask a question or provide a comment, we'd ask you to raise your hand, which you can do in the participants panel on the bottom right where it says raise hand. When it's your turn, we'll notify you and ask you to unmute yourself. If you don't want to speak, you can also submit a question through the question and answer box, which you can find on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I will hand it back to Christine for the next slide.
Thanks, Emily. So you'll see today on the agenda, it's in 2 parts, parts 1 and 2. And what we're aiming to do as part of the agenda is to provide some background on the issue, give a summary of comments received, and then, as Emily said, leave time for your questions and comments. And now I'm going to turn it over to Will to get into the meat of the discussion. Will?
Great, thanks, Christine. So, because understanding these technical questions requires a basic understanding of what a clean heat standard is, I'm just going to spend a few minutes running back over this basic description we're working from here. So clean heat standard, we're talking about a Department of Environmental Protection regulation, and it would be a requirement on heating energy suppliers. That would include suppliers of heating oil, propane, natural gas, and maybe electricity. And the requirement would be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the use of deployment of clean heat. And the way we make it into a standard, which requires some numerical kind of requirement, is to use what we're going to call clean heat credits to document the implementation of clean heat. So whatever sorts of things happen that are clean heat, we would have a process to credit those, and that would be the way that the compliance entities would comply, whether or not they implemented those things on themselves or possibly got credits from somewhere else. So that's the basic clean heat standard concept. Next slide. So the topic for today is one that stakeholders requested, which is calculation of credits by technology. And I'm going to start just like yesterday, or sort of to help you follow the plot here. When I speak, I'm going to be providing background on what's been said in various documents, including the Clean Heat Commission report, a couple of clean energy and climate plans, and our discussion document. And then Emily Lamb will also be speaking, and she'll be talking about what we heard from stakeholders about each of the topics. So from our discussion document, we pointed out that we will need to determine which technologies are eligible for crediting. And we floated in the document the idea that we might pick and choose based on particular criteria, or simply have a more kind of open process. But once we decide on a list of creditable technologies, really one of the more complicating things is trying to assign the credit value to the particular technologies. And I want to emphasize right now that the focus of this meeting, we have a lot of comments on the first part of this, which which technologies might be excluded or included in crediting. And that's not really the focus of this meeting, but we're going to talk about some of the comments and the general ideas so we can have a list of the range of technologies we might end up crediting to inform the technical discussion. So on the technical concept of calculating credits by technology and how to assign credits, the discussion document floats two basic kind of concepts. One, and I realize we have an acronym here we should have spelled out. California has a program called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, or LCFS. And under that program, basically anything in the transportation sector that can reduce emissions by substituting for fossil fuels gets a specific credit value in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. So that's one concept for calculating credits by technology, is to figure out a pathway sort of for each particular fuel, for example, and assign it a specific number. Another kind of approach, which isn't completely different, but can simplify things a little bit, is something more like where you have a sort of a generic kind of a yardstick, where you look at a standard kind of a single family home and you figure out the emission reductions in a general sense, approximate average for a single family home, and you sort of set your credits based on that, and don't try and do a detailed calculation for everything. And maybe to sort of make a little more clear the distinction here, an example of this kind of program is the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, where if you take the case of biofuels under the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, every different biofuel kind of gets a different score. But on the Renewable Fuel Standard, there's kind of yardstick based on 50% reductions as determined by EPA. And once you meet that standard, you get one credit without regard to sort of exactly what the qualifying biofuel is, as long as it qualifies. So two different kind of concepts there. One is that all the different things get a kind of a sliding scale for crediting, and the other is that there's sort of a more qualification process, and then once some things are qualified, there's a simpler way of accounting for the amount of reductions. Next slide. So we posed some specific questions for stakeholders. As I said, which clean heat technology should be eligible is one of the basic questions, but we also talked about sort of process-wise, how would you evaluate fuels that maybe aren't really in widespread use or even use at all in Massachusetts now? How exactly should you calculate the amount of credits? And what existing calculation methods could we consider or reference or adopt? We don't intend to do a sort of a restart the basic science on this topic for this program. There's a lot of great work in California and other places that we would intend to reference. So those are the kind of basic questions we asked. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over for Emily about the stakeholder comments. I did want to sort of repeat a couple of caveats. One of them is that we aren't really focused today on which technologies will be eligible so much as the technical issues around accounting for them, but we did think it would be helpful just as an update to give you some sort of a flavor about what we heard about what technologies might be included. And the second thing is just the caveat I gave yesterday that we've done our best to sort of narrow hundreds of pages of comments down to some short summaries here just to give you a flavor for the comments, and we recognize that we may not have have reflected everything perfectly, but we've done our best and we hope it's helpful. So turning it over to Emily.
Sure, thanks. So I'll just reiterate that this is a really high level summary of the comments, and there's a lot of nuance that we won't cover in this presentation. But in general, all of the commenters that talked about what type of technology should be eligible agreed that electrification should be eligible to receive credits under the program. For technologies other than electrification, there were sort of two main groups or two main points of view expressed in the comments. One was that only non-combustion technologies that are really compatible with the Commonwealth's long-term net zero goals should be able to receive credits in the program. And the other point of view was that the program should really be technology neutral and allow any activity that would reduce emissions to generate clean heat credits, even if that was some sort of combustion activity. There was also the need to have a methodology to qualify new technologies as they emerge and become commercially available was something that commenters pointed out that this program should be able to handle. So I'll ask to go to the next slide. This is just a very high level overview of the specific technologies that were called out. And this is only talking about support. So these technologies, as I said, electrification was supported by all the commenters that addressed this topic. Weatherization and energy efficiency and liquid biofuels were also supported by many of the commenters. And then a few or single commenters supported inclusion of this list of technologies, which includes renewable natural gas and hydrogen, district energy systems and combined heat and power, electric heat with fossil fuel backups, switching between fossil fuels, mostly going from heating oil to propane, and then portable clean heat units. And again, this is only summarizing what there was support for. There was also opposition to many of these things, but that's not some captured in this slide. So just want to be clear. And with that, I think we can go to the next slide. So in terms of how to actually calculate the credits, many commenters suggested that we should use pre-established methodologies, and specific examples such as the MassDEP program, the federal GREET model, or a similar life cycle analysis approach were all pointed out. Another main topic that came out from stakeholders on how we would calculate the credits is whether or not emissions from electricity generation should be included in those calculations, and if so, how we would include that consideration. So I think that's the end of this slide, although I could go through all of the details in these boxes if that would be helpful.
It seems like you covered them, but is there anything there you didn't cover in the mention?
I guess there was the one specific request that geothermal heat pumps receive extra credits as opposed to air source heat pumps. That's the type of nuance that exists in some of the comments that we, for the most part, weren't able to include in this presentation.
That's helpful, because that's a good one to flag, because I think that those kind of technical issues are the kind of things we want to hear about at this meeting. So thanks, Emily. Nick. So that's it for kind of what we heard in the comments. So we're, these are really listening sessions and questions. So we're finished with this part of the presentation. The only thing I would remind you of is that hybrid systems where there's a mix of a fossil and an electric heat configuration, we did carve off some time at the end of this meeting to delve into that, because we know that's a specific issue. So if you can hold thoughts on that topic until we do have a few slides on that. But other than that, I think we're open for input. I think, the main thing we're really trying to do now is make sure we have all the information that we could possibly have here. So if there's ways of doing calculations that, haven't heard from us that you think we should be considering or referencing or even adopting, that's a great topic for comment. But other than that, we're open for comment and questions and discussion now. And I would just mention there were some specific questions about electrification yesterday that I sort of put off till today. one reason for doing that is we're hoping to post these online and that people can, listen to one that they're particularly interested in if they wanted to. So be good to kind of have those questions again if people still have them. I could try and summarize them, but I'd rather hear them from you all again. So I guess I'll pause there. We're open for questions and input and comment.
Joe Glietto.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I was just curious how the yardstick approach would work, because if you use an approach like saying one credit would be equal to the average amount of emissions reductions achieved through full electrification of a single family home, that value changes as the grid changes and the fuel mix of the grid changes. So if you have a moving yardstick over time, how are you supposed to quantify emissions reductions from other technologies?
Sure. So it's a good question. I mean, one answer is that the yardstick in theory might not even be denominated explicitly in greenhouse gas reductions. For example, in our Clean Energy and Climate Plan, we do have estimates of the pace of electrification that needs to happen to reach a goal, and also some assumptions built in on, for example, biofuel blending. So potentially, if the standard or the requirement is structured as far as, those kind of benchmarks, then it might not be necessary to have a detailed accounting of the greenhouse gas emissions, and I would also, so I think the main thing to point out is the yardstick is, by that I just mean cases, I gave the other example, the renewable fuel standard, where if you are counting some kind of liquid biofuels, you don't actually require the documentation of the full pathway for every fuel, but you simply just allow those particular types of fuels to qualify. I think the electrification question is probably a separate one that we're happy to hear from stakeholders on. I think one of the questions is, whether we should be thinking in terms of the electrification at kind of the emissions from using electricity at kind of the time the measure happens, or whether we should look at to what degree, we're looking at a long-term transition to electricity where it may not matter as much in the view of some what the emissions are right now because of the need for that long-term transition. But I'd be happy to hear, other stakeholders, including your own kind of thoughts on what the right balance is there.
Yeah, I'd say the LCFS approach that values emissions reductions is better to use as a value for credits, simply because if this program is meant to reduce emissions and be able to account for the emissions reductions achieved, meeting the 2025 and 2030 state goals, then you have to measure a credit as greenhouse gas emissions reduced or avoided. And if you use any other method, you can't actually quantify that. And then it makes the program almost look like it's not designed to reduce emissions, it's designed to pick winners and losers technology-wise. And then as you went on to the air source heat pump thing, so if I'm a homeowner and I have a heating oil, propane, or natural gas system in my home, and I install an electric air source heat pump system, how would you value the amount of credits, or how do you foresee measuring the amount of credits generated from that action?
So this is the question we're asking for input on, but I think we do anticipate the need to have some sort of a kind of a default way of measuring things, sort of the way in the MassDEP program, they have a kind of average or amount of reductions for each measure. We don't, I don't think the discussion document doesn't sort of lean toward the idea that you'd have to have, in theory, you might need to know that house's history of their emissions to really know the actual reductions. We haven't really looked at that as realistic, but again, that's the topic for discussion, I think, today, if there are other thoughts.
Sure, yeah. I mean, when you install an air source heat pump system, you have to score the electricity used to heat that home. certainly. So if you're switching from a natural gas system, you can measure the carbon intensity of natural gas and, based on the square footage of the home, take a look at the BTUs used from that technology. And then on the other end of things, you'd have to look at the air source heat pump system that's put into place in the measure the emissions, the carbon intensity of the electric grid in the winter specifically, when that heat pump is being used for thermal use only, since this is a thermal specific program. And that way you can measure the emissions avoided between the natural gas system that was in place and the air source heat pump system that went in place there. Because of the discussions of scoring electricity as zero doesn't make a ton of sense if you're actually trying to value emissions reductions, because when you put an air source heat pump system, there are, of course, still emissions from electricity when you're using it to heat your home.
Sure, so that's probably a good cue to go on to hear from some others, because I think there are some differences thinking about that one, so.
From Raymond Albrecht in the chat, ISO New England has data on the increasing fuel consumption that will occur for power generation loads that result from heating electrification. I can help you obtain and analyze such data.
Yeah,
And then,
good, that's helpful, thanks.
Caitlin, I've asked you to unmute.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's important to reiterate that if DEP were building this program and the only goal was to reduce emissions from 2024 to 2025, sure, count electric sector emissions. But if you're actually focusing on 2050 and the end goal that we know we already have in terms of what the system will look like at that point, it's much more important to drive electrification than to nickel and dime about false alternative combustion solutions. Thanks.
Ben Butterworth.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I want to talk about in response to the comments about kind of using existing methodologies to credit emissions reduction. And well, I think in general, that's a worthwhile approach, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel in situations where it's not necessary from a GHG accounting perspective. I would like to express specific concern about the GREET model and how it treats life cycle emissions from biofuels. So thinking about life cycle emissions from biofuels, it's still a relatively new field. And I don't think we have a great handle on it yet. The California GREET model is often pointed to as kind of the gold standard for biofuels life cycle accounting. But in my opinion, the methodology there is extremely flawed. Without getting too into the details, I think a lot of the assumptions around the California GREET model, they're basing it on a counterfactual of kind of the worst possible scenario. So, for example, like an animal manure livestock facility, right? The counterfactual is that all that manure just releases methane directly to the atmosphere with absolutely no mitigation or practices to reduce methane at the point source. And obviously converting that to a biofuel and combusting it releases less emissions than just directly releasing the methane to the atmosphere. But there's a lot of different ways to regulate and reduce methane emissions at the point source other than creating biofuels like RNG. So I won't get too into the details, but I would just caution DEP specifically as it relates to GREET. And I think it warrants kind of a closer investigation into how the assumptions can be tweaked in GREET to see if it's actually a valuable methodology for informing clean heat standard policy in Massachusetts. And it might be an opportunity for Massachusetts to look to partnership with other states in the region who are also looking for kind of a solution to life cycle accounting for biofuels. And take a critical eye to GREET, think about if it makes sense for informing policy at the state level. And think about potential adjustments to the GREET methodology that might be more appropriate in the context of Massachusetts and how we're thinking about regulating methane emissions at the point source in general. So that's what I'd say about GREET. Thanks.
Yeah, and I may take a minute on that one and just help people out with a little background on GREET and give you kind of an initial reaction and maybe a chance to clarify if I'm not capturing something right. So GREET, for others' benefit, is, at least the way I think of it, is a big spreadsheet with a whole bunch of estimates in it that help you to figure out the life cycle emissions of using particular fuel. So for something like petroleum-based gasoline, it would include maybe the emissions from the energy used to extract the fuel, some emissions from a refinery process, and then emissions from transporting the fuel, and then emissions from the tailpipe of vehicles. For biofuels, some of those same kind of things transfer very well. So there's still emissions from transferring the fuel, some emissions from refining the fuel, those sorts of things. And what typically has been done, we looked at this years ago for a different program in Massachusetts, and what California has done is to take GREET as kind of a starting point and then look at whether there are parts of the GREET model as published by the Argonne National Laboratory, whether the things that may not be appropriate for a particular program. So one thing I happen to know about is in California is that they don't use the same factor in their part of the analysis for crop-based biofuels for the land use change component. They do that separately and don't use the number that is the default for the Argonne National Laboratory. And I think, Ben, I think it does seem to me like, certainly the voided methane part of it is something that would be likely to have regional variation and would be something that we would be expecting to take a hard look at. So I think it's the idea of using GREET as the underlying concept doesn't, I think what I hear a comment from you that I think we I can say would be where we'd be likely to head is that even if we were to use GREET, there would still be an opportunity to have discussion about what the particular assumptions for particular fuel sources are, for sure.
Stephen Dodge.
Thank you. Just a couple of brief comments in response to some of the last couple of comments that were made. First of all, I don't believe in our comments we've submitted on from Clean Fuels Alliance America. Our comments reflect this. There really is a need to reinvent the wheel. Tweaking, yes, but reinventing the wheel with regard to the yardstick, the most important yardstick, in this case, GREET, probably doesn't need to be done. Just again, from a 60,000 foot level, I'm not the technical person, but GREET, in all the states that have LCFS programs, GREET is the accepted model, all of them. California, Washington, Oregon. The states that are currently looking at an LCFS type of program for either transportation or thermal heat, Vermont, New York, Maryland, are also looking seriously at the GREET model. GREET is updated regularly. It's probably being updated even as we speak. And I guess I have to say, without trying to be flippant, but if it's suitable for the fourth largest economy in the country, and that's California, and probably the most difficult economy with regard to carbon reduction and emissions reductions, I think it's okay for Massachusetts. I think it's wise to look at options that are out there, other options that are out there. But I think if you want a tried and true and accurate yardstick, I think GREET or something very similar is got to be the way that Massachusetts has to go, like the other states. And just one other brief comment in response to a couple comments ago about liquid fuels. We're not talking about liquid fuels being around for a year or two. We're talking about being around for decades, because electrification is an important pathway, but it cannot be the only pathway. And the most cost-efficient way to reduce carbon emissions today, not in 10 years, not in 2030, not in 2040, not in 2045 or 2050, to do it today, and a ton of carbon reduced today is worth more than a ton reduced 10 or 20 years from now, is for low carbon liquid fuels. So it makes sense for the program to include all low carbon fuels, including liquid fuels. And, we talk about this, I know there's a belief out there that all combustion is bad. Well, low carbon combustion in the near term is certainly better than petroleum-based, fossil fuel-based combustion, which is what we're seeing now. So obviously, we'll respond more, but I appreciate the opportunity to make those comments. Thank you.
So that's helpful. I do want to try and stick to the technical part of it, although to the extent we're hearing, arguments on one side or the other, accounting things, we should certainly allow people to react. But one thing I did want to ask about or question is one of the things, the component that California doesn't use from the Argonne lab is the component that deals with land use change from biofuels. And one of the pieces of that analysis is that the emissions are evaluated for the land use change over a 30-year life cycle. So they're not immediate reductions. It's an assessment over the effect over a 30-year life cycle. So that's another piece we may need to consider as we think about how to deal with the liquid biofuels part of it going forward, at least the crop-based part of that.
From Raymond Albrecht, heat pumps have a service life of perhaps 10 years or slightly more depending on usage. The carbon credit calculation needs to be based on grid characteristics during the same period. New England needs about 30,000 megawatts of renewable capacity to cover existing grid loads before renewable power can drive thermal systems. That level of growth is still a long way off. And then from Caitlin Peel Sloan, California's use of GREET for dairy manure and the perverse incentives it inspires is an object lesson in how not to use GREET.
I think I can just take those two as comments. Anything?
Ben Butterworth, thanks, Will. Agree that underlying assumptions in GREET can be tweaked in such a way that provide useful life cycle emissions information related to biofuels. Was just cautioning that if incorrectly deployed, as it is in the California GREET model, particularly in the case of dairy manure biofuels, it could seriously negatively impact the ability of the clean heat standard to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Got it, thanks.
And no other hands or comments right now.
I think we can move on. This isn't your last chance anyway. We're going to move on a little bit ahead of schedule to introduce the second topic we have for today, but it's related to this one, and it may even inspire some more discussion on the electricity part of it because it's focused on electricity. So pause just a minute more and then move on. So we're going to go through the same cycle with the question of hybrid heat system credits. Next slide. So the discussion document defines a hybrid system as one where you have a fossil fuel system retained in the place where you've put the clean heat. So the clean heat does reduce the emissions by reducing the need to operate that system, but there still is a fossil fuel system retained. And so the Clean Energy and Climate Plan also deals with this, and it gives an example where it's really not even just a backup, but it's a case where the system might be sized for air conditioning and it's only covering less than well under 100%, not capable of doing 100% of the heating. And so that could reduce emissions if it's used in such a way that it's used for heating, but it doesn't necessarily inherently do that. So that's kind of the issue with hybrid heat systems and the complexity of it. Next slide. I guess we'll go ahead to the comments.
Or yes. So the comments on hybrid heat systems, many commenters pointed out that there's a wide variety of technologies and also use patterns for these hybrid systems. And related to that, they would need specialized crediting and some sort of verification and reporting requirements that would be unique to these types of systems. They can also make achieving net zero more challenging and expensive, was pointed out by many commenters. And many commenters also noted that estimating the greenhouse gas emissions from hybrid systems is more challenging because of some of those use patterns that Will just talked about. A few commenters pointed out that hybrid systems can raise the cost of the energy system maintenance. And a few also noted that hybrid systems are good for consumer choice because they allow people to have more options. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Will for the next slide.
Great, thanks. So we have a few things we'd like to deal with here. First of all, underlying question of what we should really call a hybrid system. Should any hybrid system, sort of meaning any clean heat, no matter how much it's used, be eligible for crediting in the first place? And then we're open to ideas about how we might verify and evaluate hybrid systems to the extent they're counted in the program. I think we're open for comments, question, and discussion.
Joe Uglietto.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I was curious on air source heat pump eligibility. In the APS specifically, they require a air source heat pump installation to have a minimum capacity to supply 90% or more of the annual heat load of the home. I'm curious your thoughts on a minimum eligibility requirement for air source heat pumps and what the DEP was thinking on how to determine whether a air source heat pump system would be eligible for the clean heat standard.
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that, but I would just kind of refer it back a little bit. The LCFS versus yardstick question was, captures a number of different things, but I think, the arguments on both sides of that we've heard is the, LCFS, the low carbon fuel standard, where you give everything a life cycle score, sort of argues for, even if it's only 50%, that's reducing emissions and they really should get some credit. But the other side of it is that, if that system isn't really big enough to get permanently, the home or business off of clean heat, maybe it really isn't something that should be supported at all. But I don't have anything to add to that as to sort of which way we're leaning or how we're going to manage that. There certainly are, quantification challenges on a hybrid system that are less challenging potentially with a full home conversion.
Yeah, what I found in the APS and registering and filling out applications for systems for homeowners is a lot of homeowners will put in a new air conditioning system and they'll be told by the installer, well, you'll get an extra incentive if you put in these heat pumps. And they might have the capacity to provide 90% or more of the annual heat load of the home, but they're actually never used for heating purposes. They'll keep their legacy heat source in place, whether it's nat gas, propane, or heating oil, and then receive this huge thermal incentive for a system that they never actually use for heating. So I find that when there's no way to verify or measure that the heat pump system is being used for heating at all, that it's a lot easier to say that will credit systems that are whole home air source heat pump conversions that remove the legacy fossil fuel system and avoid a hybrid system altogether, especially because for the majority, at least of what I've seen in the APS and what's happening in Massachusetts, is installers tell homeowners you're going to get this huge added incentive for this air conditioning system you're looking to put in. If you put heat pumps in instead, they're never actually used for heating. So we kind of have a false flag or false data in the sense of that we have, mostly or hybrid homes that aren't actually using the heat pumps at all for thermal use.
Yeah, we did raise in the discussion document, we are aware of the idea that you would, it does seem like if you have still a fossil system, you likely need some sort of ongoing verification to make sure that it's not being used instead of the system that's installed, and you're not, as you said, supporting installation of something that's not actually reducing emissions. So that is one of the challenges for sure.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge in the APS is they do a 10-year forward minting calculation for valuing and minting credits. So if you install an air source heat pump system in your home, they calculate over the lifetime, the 10-year lifetime of the system, how many credits would be generated by that system and give them all up front to the homeowner. So I was curious on your thoughts on quarterly minting of these systems for the life of the system versus giving them estimated emissions for the lifespan of the system all up front. Because one, what it does is it shows a false sign on the credits given in the emissions reductions achieved all the way up front in year one versus over the lifetime of the system if you were to do quarterly minting.
Yeah, I don't think we've thought too much through the arithmetic of quarterly minting versus upfront. I think, I think you've and others have pointed out there are some issues with the forward minting concept. I think that one of the since in the kind of converse of the challenging part of the hybrid system is that if you can really define a full conversion and have people that are really removing other equipment, then that's a case where you really probably do need to and also may want to provide some upfront sort of incentive. So I think that's, kind of implied in the discussion document, something we're looking at. I think I'm going to move on from you a little bit, Joe, but we can certainly welcome back once we get to some other questioners.
Stephen Dodge.
Thank you. Just a quick comment again, appreciate this opportunity in the definition of hybrid systems. And I noticed, and you put an excerpt from the 2025-2030 plan that talks about hybrid liquid fuel systems being hybrid and including fossil-based liquid fuels. And I just want to remind you that need not be the case. You can have fossil-free liquid fuels as well. And so I would encourage the department to look closely at the extensive research and testing that NORA has done in their net zero homes. There were several locations, and they're working on additional locations as well, where a combination of solar panels and B100 fuel creates a net zero home. And so I would encourage the department to look into that as well and include it as a definition of a hybrid system.
Thank you.
From Raymond Albrecht, you can use U.S. Department of Energy Energy Plus software to evaluate hybrid system performance. Hourly analysis are not difficult. Your stakeholders can help with this.
Great. Yeah. I'll also just react that we are in touch with people both internally and externally that work on MassSave that I know has done some work on this, not that we'll necessarily adopt all of that, but we are certainly working on those, learning more about those kind of questions on our own also.
Ben Butterworth.
Okay, yeah, sorry, thanks. Yeah, so I've been thinking about this topic of how to kind of measure the emissions reduction impact associated with hybrid systems, and it is complicated and pretty challenging, right? Like if you envision, a house that has a propane heating system and, ductless mini split, right? I would like to avoid, a clean heat standard that credits, one home that has the heat pumps installed but never uses them for heating, and one home that uses the heat pumps for 99% of their winter heating load, crediting them at the same level of greenhouse gas reduction avoided. I realize that's technically challenging, and I haven't fully thought out the perfect solution for it, but I think it is going to need to be eventually reliant on actual electricity consumption data, either kind of monitored, monthly or quarterly, to see how much electricity consumption is really spiking in individual buildings during the winter period, right? Because that's going to give you a good indicator of how much those buildings are actually reliant on their air source heat pump heating system, rather than just strictly relying on them for cooling in the summer months. So how that data gets accessed, and what kind of what the steps are to getting there. I realize that's a challenge, but I think it's just a topic that needs to be flagged kind of early in this process and thought through in careful detail with the right kind of stakeholders at the table. That's my comment on that.
That's helpful, and I'd point out, and if you have other thoughts about this, we're happy to hear them. One of the technical questions is what resolution you really need the data to do that. As you know, there's a lot of studies of consumption of different loads, but they tend to rely on hourly, meeting installed at, homes to make detailed measurements. But as you mentioned, there may be characteristics of monthly data that are helpful also, and that is something that's occurred to us. And if you have additional thoughts about that, we'd be happy to hear it.
Kevin Grant, can you point us to the scientific analysis that Massachusetts is planning on utilizing to account for the emissions of electricity, if different from GREET, the EPA, and even the United Nations IPCC, which account for electrical generation emissions by using the carbon intensity of the fuel utilized?
Yeah, no decisions have been made. I would say that we would be unlikely to use one of those because we've done so much work on Massachusetts specific measurement. So there's a couple of things that you might consider. One is we publish emissions from our retail electricity sellers as though they were emitters. So in other words, if a company sells a certain amount of electricity, they submit a report to us where they multiply that amount of electricity by an emission factor that we provide that's based on how we do our emissions inventory. So one place we would likely look is at those emission factors that we already publish for use in calculating emissions. I think the other question is whether, if we're trying to evaluate something like a heat pump on a going forward basis, how much we rely on the fact that we do have a clean energy standard in place that gets us quite close to, with very low electricity emissions in the early 2030s, assuming full compliance and a number of initiatives to bring in additional clean energy. So to the extent that's something we need to consider, that's a sort of a separate question. So those are two places that we might refer to.
Caitlin Peel Sloan, Massachusetts accounts for electricity emissions in the electric sector of the inventory. Ben Butterworth, I think monthly data is more than adequate. Honestly, even quarterly data on a household by household basis would be very telling in terms of actual utilization of air source heat pump system during winter months for space heating. Perhaps some complicated on commercial side given different set of electricity end uses. And
Thanks,
Jim
Josh.
Blake.
I think I caught the second one as a comment, but I didn't hear the first because I didn't. Can you repeat? I think it was Caitlin's comment, or I just know if it was a question. I guess not. But
more a comment. Massachusetts accounts for electricity emissions in the electric sector of the inventory.
Right, that is true.
And Jim Blake, when considering, quote, liquid fuels, it is important to understand that propane and renewable propane are actually, quote, liquefied gases and are not methane-based fuels.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Raymond Albrecht, the EPA Clean Air Markets Program database, CAMP, has excellent hourly data for existing power plants in New England. The CAMPD and ISO New England can be combined to accomplish what you were looking at regarding understanding the CO2 emissions resulting from heat pump operation.
So I think you just caught me in something that I should acknowledge, which is that we do have comments that have come up a couple of times, and this is in the Clean Heat Commission report, and I think also referenced in the discussion document, that the emissions may vary seasonally, and those electricity sector emission factors I mentioned would not capture that. So that is something we would maybe look at. We would still try and do it in some sort of a way that's consistent with our inventory. But that would be a complication that we might choose to consider if we look more closely at electricity emissions. So that's a helpful reminder.
And I'm not seeing any other comments or raised hands at this time.
Let me pause for a minute. Go ahead and move on to the last slide while we're waiting for our next slide. So as a reminder, and this is the last of the meetings where if you think of something after the end of this meeting, you might get another chance at the end of the meeting tomorrow. So we do have another meeting tomorrow covering these additional topics. Next slide. So. I think we have an additional chat item maybe.
Yep, Joe Uglietto, when determining the obligation on fossil fuel suppliers, how will you account for year-over-year differences in degree days?
Yeah, so we've floated, I mean, I think to say it differently, there are different amount, the emissions from even more so than other sectors that have been regulated this way, transportation and electricity, the emissions from the heating sector do vary quite a bit more from year to year. So we don't really want to have a situation where the compliance obligation varies a lot year to year. So I think one possibility, and we'll need to look at other options, that this is kind of related to what came up with yesterday. One option is to actually have some way of taking the, a measure of the weather, which would be degree days, and somehow adjusting the emissions number that's associated, based on the number of degree days. Other options we talked about yesterday are multiple year compliance periods and sort of things that are variations on that, including banking credits and borrowing credits, so that you can spread out the variability over a number of years where it's both less pronounced and also you have more kind of notice of what's going on.
And we do have another question in the questions and answer function from Mariette Haggerty-Perot. Apologies if this was covered in a separate forum, but how is the department determining how much natural gas is used for heating versus other end uses, given the distribution system also serves cooking loads, domestic hot water, combined heat and power, etc.?
Great question. It is off topic, but we are at the time period when I think we can open to other things. I think the answer is nothing in what we've proposed so far suggests that we would attempt to make that distinction. So we would, I think in the long term, the expectation is that, assuming, and because we're moving off natural gas for heating, it's likely over time, with or without the clean heat standard, that brings along with it reductions in natural gas for other things. So we haven't talked about a method for trying to get reporting of the different uses of the fuels, and there's no basis right now for thinking that's a possibility.
And then from Raymond Albrecht, New York ISO is a leader on this question. They do long-term rolling averages, but with a slow downward trend in heating degree days over the next 30-year period.
Right, that is another option, to do some sort of rolling average as the basis for compliance. It ends up being similar to multi-year compliance or banking and borrowing, but yeah, that's helpful. All right, a reminder that the main topic for here is calculating credits, including hybrid systems. So just throwing that out there in case that jogs anybody's memory about what you wanted to ask on that topic. And then other than that, I think we're at our kind of last call moment. Is that right, Josh? We don't have anything else right now?
Correct.
Okay, so as Christine mentioned, we have the ability to submit comments and questions on the climate strategies page. Sign up for the email list, and our webpage has lots of additional information. So with that, I think we're ready to close the meeting.